I'm Tim, and welcome to Watch You Want. Thanks for logging on. Today, we are looking at one of the most distinctive and most important Rolex Oyster models of all time. This is the Rolex 116254 Datejust Turn-O-Graph. Yes, the Turn-O-Graph. Arguably the missing link in the Rolex sports watch continuity, this watch predates, as a design, predates both the Submariner and the Rolex GMT, and that's significant for two reasons. First and foremost, because in many ways this watch helped to inspire the ultimate production version of the 1954 Submariner. Released in 1953, the Turn-O-Graph, then just known as the Rolex Turn-O-Graph, was the first Rolex watch to feature a rotating bezel, which was calibrated and could be used for timing. Now, it also predated the 1954 to 55 Rolex GMT, and that's important because while that watch is known as Rolex's most iconic pilot's watch, you could argue that the Turn-O-Graph, with its rotating bezel and its widespread use in aviation, including official use in military aviation, was the first Rolex pilot's watch as well. So here we have a watch that established an important tradition of rotating bezel sports watches and preempted two iconic Rolex sports watch models, the Submariner and the GMT Master. We're going to talk a little bit more about the history of this watch and why it's popularly known as the Thunderbird. But first, let's look at the wrist fit and talk a bit about the basic aesthetics and features of this latest generation 6-digit reference 116254 Datejust Turn-O-Graph. Now the watch you're looking at here is a 36mm stainless steel and 18-karat white gold watch, and that's significant because those two metals are essentially complementary to each other. You can see there is a slight difference in tone between the fluted and polished rotating 18-karat white gold bezel and the brushed and polished stainless steel bracelet and case, and it's a good kind of contrast. It's subtle, like this entire watch, between the delicately used shocks of red on the dial, on the seconds hand, and on the date wheel, as well as the contrast with the anthracite dial and the applied white gold indexes. There's just enough contrast to make this watch lively, to make this watch intriguing, visually animated, but not enough to make it look over the top. It's not an extrovert's watch. It's a rare effort that combines just a little bit of animated design with a classical, timeless look. Now, any Rolex using an Oyster case and the standard Datejust profile is going to be something of a classic. It's going to have a classical, traditional look on the wrist. What you get with the Turn-O-Graph is a slightly more, I would say, butch, sports-oriented aesthetic. This is not your standard fluted bezel, partial or fully precious metal Datejust reference. This is a watch that holds its own against the more sports-oriented Sea Dweller, Submariner, GMT, and Explorer members of the Rolex Oyster lineup. Because this watch is a white metal watch, it's extremely versatile, and I always like the combination of a dark dial with a white metal. For me, that's the ultimate power combo that wears well with any kind of clothing. Long sleeves, short sleeves, formal, informal, you name it. This is a watch with 100-meter water resistance and a screw-down crown, so it lives up to the promise of that Oyster case. It's as versatile as anything out there, and with a full 3-link Oyster bracelet. Now, these could also be had on the Jubilees, so I feel that with this one equipped with the Oyster, it really fulfills the promise of the Oyster case, and it looks the part of a sports watch. The Jubilee being a 5-link, a little bit more delicate design, it doesn't have quite the same butch masculinity to it. I'm going to say that as a 36mm watch, this one wears bigger than its size. I would say that because of the shoulder of the Rolex case, because of the width of the lugs, because of the height and full body of the lugs, this wears similar to a conventional 40mm watch, and you can see on my wrist, which is 6 1/3 inches, 16 centimeters, it has a lot of presence, it has a good stance, it doesn't overlap the edges of my wrist. A bigger wrist could wear this perfectly comfortably with plenty of panache. This is not one for a smaller wrist, although it will play nice with a smaller wrist. It's a great reference for anyone who appreciates the history and the styling subtlety of this anthracite dial, stainless steel, white gold Rolex Datejust Turn-O-Graph. And let's go back to that history element, because that's a big part of the appeal of this watch. Not only does it embody a host of historical firsts in the Rolex continuity, and let's face it, the history of Rolex reads like a catalog of watchmaking's all-time greats, but the bottom line is that this is one of the few watches in the Rolex catalog that has truly deep and authentic military associations. I don't mean some guys bought it at the PX for use in Vietnam. I don't mean that in a couple of cases it was issued to special forces. I mean this watch was officially branded with the U.S. Air Force Thunderbirds logo during the 1950s. It was an official association between the U.S. Air Force and the Rolex watch company in the 50s, to the point that the Thunderbirds and their logo and all associated marks appeared in Rolex advertisements for the Turn-O-Graph references in the 50s. Moreover, the squadron, which is the Air Force's version of the Navy Blue Angels flight demonstration squadron, basically hotshots doing aerobatics at air shows to showcase their prowess and competence. The Thunderbirds were actually issued these watches for use in the cockpit, the idea being that if you weren't flying internationally piloting a commercial aircraft, a GMT watch was far less important than a watch with a rotating bezel that would give you the ability to time maneuvers, especially standard rate turns. That was very important to pilots then, remains important to pilots today, and the idea of having a watch that could withstand the bumps and bruises of high-performance flight while also serving that purpose was very appealing to the Thunderbirds. So in the same sense that those Panerai Luminor dive watches were associated with special forces during the 1930s and 40s, to the same extent that the Tudor submariners were associated with American and British forces during the 60s and 70s, and the Blancpain 50 Fathoms was associated with French combat swimmers during the 50s. During the 50s, the Datejust Turn-O-Graph was the ticket if you were the absolute hottest pilots in the U.S. Air Force. And that association and the Thunderbird nickname sticks to this day. Now, as of 2011, you can no longer get this watch. It is a discontinued reference, and it's something of a cult classic in as much as only watch guys who really know their stuff understand what this watch is all about. But with a clean aesthetic, with that dark dial and white metal combination, with the clever use of red highlights, the watch has a universal aesthetic appeal. So you don't need to know the history of this watch to appreciate it. When you do know the history, it becomes something like love at first sight. This is a great reference with a fantastic backstory, and half the appeal of any luxury watch is the story behind it. Automatic winding, 50-hour power reserve, COSC certified Swiss chronometer movement. It's a 3135 in there, so it has the same beating heart as a Sea Dweller or a Submariner. It's just as rugged internally. It has that famed Rolex precision and durability. This watch is an outstanding choice for anyone looking for an unusual Rolex that you're not going to see every day, that nevertheless embodies the best qualities of the brand and its iconic products. See it on our website, Watch You Want, with all original Rolex boxes, papers, and accessories. This is the Rolex Datejust Turn-O-Graph, also known as the Thunderbird, reference 116254.